When the lawyer finished reading the will, the room fell into a silence so heavy it felt like dust settling after a collapse, and the three siblings, Elias, Mara, and Jonah, sat frozen, staring at the old wooden desk as if it might explain how their stepmother, Ruth Calder, had managed one final cruelty from beyond the grave, because instead of money, instead of the suburban house she'd lived in, instead of anything that resembled care, she had left them a vineyard so dry and lifeless it barely qualified as land, a stretch of cracked earth on the edge of a forgotten valley where dead vines twisted like bones and the air smelled of neglect, a vineyard everyone in town called Ruth's Folly, and as the lawyer cleared his throat and said, "You are now joint owners," Jonah laughed under his breath, Mara clenched her jaw, and Elias felt something old and bitter rise in his chest, because Ruth had never loved them, not when their father was alive and certainly not after he died, and now, even in death she had found a way to remind them of their place. Years earlier, when their father brought Ruth home, she arrived with stiff smiles and careful words, a woman who kept her affection measured and her expectations sharp, and while she never raised a hand to them, her indifference cut deeper than anger ever could, especially after their father passed suddenly and the house grew colder, quieter, ruled by rules instead of warmth, and when she finally sent them away, Elias to work construction in the city, Mara to care for her own family, Jonah drifting wherever he could, none of them believed they'd ever return. Yet here they were, years later, standing on the edge of that same dry vineyard under a sky bleached by sun, the wind rattling dead leaves like laughter, and Jonah kicked at the dirt and said, "So what now, we sell it for pennies?" But Mara shook her head slowly, something stubborn in her eyes, because the land, as dead as it looked, was still theirs, and Elias remembered something their father once said when they were children, walking these same rows when the vines were green, that land remembers how it was loved, even if people forget, and that thought followed them as they walked deeper into the vineyard, past broken posts and collapsed irrigation lines, past a small shed leaning like it had given up, and something strange happened, something none of them could explain, because beneath the bitterness and exhaustion, beneath the anger at Ruth's final joke, a question formed quietly in each of them. What if this wasn't an insult, but a test? What if Ruth, in her own twisted way, had left them not with nothing, but with a choice, to abandon the land as she had abandoned them, or to stay and fight for something no one else believed in anymore? That night, as the sun bled red over the valley and the vineyard fell into shadow, Elias stood alone between the rows and imagined vines heavy with grapes again, imagined life where everyone saw death, and if this story already has you leaning closer, wondering whether broken land and broken people can truly change their fate, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now, because what happens next will prove that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't wealth, but the chance to rise where everyone expects you to fail. They slept that first night in the old farmhouse at the edge of the vineyard, a place Ruth had never bothered to repair, where the floor creaked with every step and the walls smelled of dust and time, and none of them said it out loud but all of them felt it, that this place was a mirror of what they had become after being pushed out into the world, worn down but not completely broken. And in the early hours before dawn Elias woke to the sound of wind moving through the dead vines and stepped outside, wrapping his jacket tighter as he stared across the land, remembering how as a boy he had run barefoot between these rows while his father laughed and told him to respect the soil, and when the sun finally rose it revealed just how bad things were, irrigation pipes cracked beyond simple repair, vines brittle from years without care, weeds choking what little life remained, and Jonah shook his head and muttered that they were fools for staying, but Mara knelt and pressed her fingers into the dirt, surprised to feel coolness beneath the surface, a hint of moisture hiding under neglect, and she said quietly, "It's not dead, it's just been ignored," and that sentence hung between them like a challenge. They spent the next days arguing, fixing small things, discovering how much work it would take just to bring water back to the land, and each argument peeled back old wounds, Jonah accusing Elias of always wanting to prove something, Elias snapping that Jonah always ran when things got hard, Mara trying to keep peace while carrying her own resentment for years spent caring for everyone else, and yet every evening they stayed, because leaving felt like letting Ruth win, felt like admitting that the coldness she showed them was the truth of who they were. One afternoon an old neighbor named Mateo stopped by, leaning on his cane, eyes narrowing as he surveyed the vineyard, and he laughed softly and said, I wondered when you kids would come back." And when Elias asked why Ruth had kept the vineyard instead of selling it, Mateo shrugged and said, "Because she believed suffering builds strength. She just never knew how to love without pain," and those words landed harder than any insult. Because for the first time they saw Ruth not just as cruel, but as someone shaped by her own failures. Weeks passed, hands blistered, tempers flared, and slowly the vineyard responded, a trickle of water returning, a few vines showing green at the edges, small signs that effort was being noticed, and one night Jonah admitted he had never stayed anywhere long enough to see something grow, and Mara confessed she was terrified of hoping again, and Elias told them he was tired of running from the past. And under the stars, surrounded by land everyone else had written off, they made a decision that would change everything. They would give the vineyard one full season, no excuses, no quitting. If you're feeling the pull of this journey, if you want to see whether broken ground can still bear fruit and whether people hurt by indifference can rebuild something real, don't forget to subscribe to the channel now, because the turning point is coming, and what happens next in this vineyard will surprise everyone, including them. By mid-season the valley began to whisper about them, about the three siblings who should have sold the land and disappeared but instead were out there every sunrise, sleeves rolled up, hands dark with soil, learning the language of vines the hard way, and the work changed them slowly, the way real change always does, not with miracles but with repetition and resolve, because Elias started waking with purpose instead of anger. Jonah stopped checking his phone for the next escape, and Mara laughed more than she had in years, even when exhaustion bent her shoulders, and though progress was uneven, some vines refusing to revive, others collapsing despite their care, they learned to celebrate small victories, the first leaf unfurling like a promise, the first repaired line carrying water where there had been none, and one evening as they worked late, a storm rolled in without warning, rain hammering the earth so hard it turned dust to mud, and instead of running for shelter they stood there stunned, letting it soak them, watching water pool at the roots of vines that had been thirsty for years, and Elias felt tears mix with rain as he realized this land had been waiting, patiently, for someone to believe in it again. The next morning damage greeted them, posts down, rows flooded, weeks of work undone in places, and Jonah nearly broke, shouting that the vineyard was cursed, that Ruth had doomed them on purpose, but Mara grabbed his arm and said something that stopped him cold. If she wanted us to fail, then surviving this is how we win, and so they rebuilt again, stronger this time, learning which vines to cut away so others could live, a lesson that mirrored their own lives more closely than any of them liked to admit. Word spread, and soon Mateo returned with advice, then another neighbor with spare equipment, then a retired vintner who shook his head at the land but smiled at their effort, and help came not because the vineyard was valuable, but because commitment is contagious, and as summer burned on, green replaced brown, life returned to rows long abandoned, and one afternoon Elias uncovered a rusted lockbox beneath the floor of the shed, inside it a notebook wrapped in oilcloth, brittle pages filled with their father's handwriting, records of soil conditions, pruning methods, notes about each section of the vineyard, and at the back, a single line written years after his death in a different hand, Ruth's, reading, "If they ever come back, maybe this will teach them what I never could," and the room fell silent as understanding settled in, because the vineyard hadn't been left to punish them, but to force them to grow where comfort could not, and whether that realization softened their anger or sharpened their resolve, none of them could say, but it changed how they worked, with less resentment and more intention. As harvest approached, the vines bore modest fruit, not enough to impress the market, not enough to erase years of neglect, but enough to prove possibility, enough to mark the moment everything shifted, and as they stood together at sunset, looking out over rows that no longer looked dead, Elias thought about how close they had come to walking away, and if this story is gripping you, if you're wondering how far this transformation will go and what the vineyard still has in store for them, now is the perfect moment to subscribe to the channel, because the final stretch of this chapter reveals the decision that will change their future forever.